Imagine this. No internet, no printed books, no nightly news drifting in through a glowing screen. Just the hush of a cold room, the smell of wax and ink, and the soft rasp of a quill. If you wanted to know whether a king was noble or cruel, or if a great battle truly echoed across the valleys, you had only two paths. You could trust the sacred ink of the chroniclers, or you could follow the living voice of the storytellers. And here is the twist that still matters today. One of them could reshape the truth so gently, you might never notice. Here is my promise to you. By the end of this story, you will see how these guardians of memory shaped the past. You will also discover why a few medieval secrets survived only because someone dared to bend a fact, or soften an edge, or nudge a tale toward a greater meaning. Let me take you first into the scriptorium. Imagine the quiet. A monk lifts his head from the page. He is tired, but the candle still holds a small, stubborn flame. He is not copying numbers on a ledger. He is choosing what a kingdom will remember. He writes of a prince who gave bread to the poor on a winter morning. He does not mention the day the same prince refused to open the granary. The chronicler is not just recording events. He is shaping a future memory. In many monasteries across lands that would become France, England, and the German principalities, men like Einhard set down the lives of rulers. They wrote with loyalty, and sometimes with fear, and often with hope that good stories would make better kings. Now step outside with me. The night is soft and there is a fire at the center of a village. A bardo clears his throat, and the circle leans in. The air smells of ale and smoke. A child watches the flames dance and waits for the first line. The storyteller begins. He sings of a hunter who broke an oath and got lost in the forest until a stranger helped him find the path again. People nod. Every face says, "We know this feeling," because oaths are hard to keep, and forests live inside us. The storyteller brings news as well, hidden in rhythm so it can travel far. He tells of a lord who raised taxes, but he wraps the fact in a legend so the message crosses the next town without punishment. He carries a living archive, passed by memory, shaped by voice, and held in trust by the people who listen. Here is something that surprises many of us. The lines between ink and song were never as sharp as we imagine. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a history that placed King Arthur in the story of a nation, and the breath of those pages feels like a bard's voice fixed on parchment. And long before a clerk set his quill to the page, traveling singers braided local tales into larger tapestries, so that a boy in a coastal village could know the courage of a hero from deep inland. The chroniclers guarded order. The storytellers guarded meaning. The monk's ink could crown a reputation with the elegance of a sentence. The singer's voice could rescue a forgotten courage from vanishing. Both saw themselves as truthful in their own way. The chronicler's truth served stability. The storyteller's truth served memory and community, and yet both sometimes stretched the cloth. A few chroniclers described lights in the sky and called them holy signs. Some storytellers softened the cruelties of lords so a village could keep hope through another winter. Were these lies or a different kind of honesty shaped by purpose? There were risks. Words carried weight. A singer who teased a powerful man with a clever rhyme might have to move on quickly before morning. A chronicler who wrote an inconvenient truth could watch that page disappear from the archive by the next season. In one place, a tale might be called heresy. In another, it would be called consolation. What I love most are the small human moments that slip through. A note in a margin where a tired scribe complains about the cold. A verse added to a familiar ballad after a flood, so the village will remember who helped first. In such details, you can feel real people reaching for each other across time. And here we are, many centuries after the birth of Christ, still listening. We read the careful lines monks left behind, and we hear echoes of the songs that once rose over fields and market squares. Together they made a memory that breathes. One gave the past the shape of law and lineage. The other gave it feeling and color, the warmth of a human voice. If this kind of mystery calls to you, let's keep the conversation alive. If you love hidden corners of history, leave a simple yes in the comments. Share this with someone who dreams in candlelight and old songs. And if you want more of these forgotten threads woven back into the tapestry, subscribe to the Medieval Archives. There are many more voices waiting just beyond the firelight. You know, when we think about medieval chroniclers today, We picture these quiet, devoted monks hunched over their desks in candlelit monasteries, faithfully recording history as it happened. But here's the truth that might surprise you. These men weren't just writing down facts. They were crafting narratives, shaping reputations, and yes, sometimes inventing reality itself to serve whoever held the purse strings. Think about it this way. Imagine you're a powerful king in the 12th century. You've just won a battle, or maybe you've done something a bit questionable to claim your throne. Who's going to remember your version of events? The answer is simple: whoever writes it down. And in a world where most people couldn't read or write, the person holding the quill held enormous power. These chroniclers were usually monks, priests, or educated men who worked in royal courts or monasteries. They had access to the materials that most people could only dream of: parchment, ink, education, and most importantly, the ear of the powerful. But this access came with strings attached. A chronicler writing in a monastery funded by the church knew better than to criticize church doctrine. A chronicler employed by a king understood that his comfortable position depended on making that king look good. One chronicler from the 12th century actually wrote something remarkably honest for his time. He said that history is the teacher of life, but only if it serves those in power. Can you imagine? He was essentially admitting that what he wrote wasn't objective truth but curated reality, designed to support the existing order. And here's where it gets really fascinating. Some chroniclers didn't just bend the truth or leave out inconvenient details. They actively invented miraculous events to please the church and reinforce religious authority. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was one of the most important historical records of early medieval England, contains passages describing dragons appearing in the sky. Dragons in the sky. And these weren't presented as folklore or legend. They were written as factual observations, recorded as divine signs meant to prove God's hand in earthly affairs. Now you might wonder why anyone would believe such things. But remember, this was a world where most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Their understanding of what was possible came from what they were told by authorities they trusted. If a learned monk who could read Latin said he'd recorded reports of dragons, who were they to argue? But the real power of chroniclers went beyond just recording miracles. They could destroy reputations just as easily as they could build them. Picture this scenario. You're a noble in medieval Europe, and you've made an enemy of someone with connections. That enemy pays a chronicler to write terrible things about you. Maybe he claims you committed crimes you never did, or questions your family's legitimacy, or accuses you of cowardice in battle. Once that's written down and copied, once it's sitting in monastery libraries where future generations will read it, your reputation is dead. Even centuries later, historians would find that chronicle and take it as evidence of who you really were. The written word had a permanence that made it terrifying. There was no right to reply, no social media post to set the record straight. If a chronicler decided to paint you as a villain, you became a villain in history's eyes. And here's the cruel irony. The very thing that made chronicles so valuable, their permanence, also made them dangerous weapons. But not everyone went along with this system quietly. Some people saw what was happening and tried to resist, tried to tell different stories or preserve truths that the powerful wanted buried. And many of them paid dearly for it. They faced exile, imprisonment, or worse. Because challenging the official narrative in a world where that narrative was controlled by kings, and the church wasn't just rebellious, it was dangerous. What's remarkable is how much of this system we've simply accepted as historical fact. When we read medieval chronicles today, we're often reading propaganda dressed up as history. We're seeing events through the eyes of people who had very specific reasons to present things in particular ways. The battles they emphasized, the kings they praised, the miracles they recorded, all of it filtered through the lens of power and patronage. Yet despite all this manipulation, despite the invented miracles and the biased accounts, we owe these chroniclers an enormous debt. Without them, entire centuries would be lost to us. We wouldn't know the names of kings, the dates of battles, or the progression of dynasties. Even their biased accounts give us windows into medieval life, politics, and culture that we wouldn't otherwise have. The chroniclers were walking contradictions, both preservers and distorters of truth, both guardians of memory and servants of power. They saved history, even as they shaped it to serve their masters. While chroniclers were busy writing history for kings and bishops, there was an entirely different kind of historian walking the dusty roads of medieval Europe. These were the storytellers, the bards, the wandering performers who carried the memories and dreams of ordinary people in their heads and hearts. If the chroniclers were the official record keepers, then the storytellers were something far more subversive. They were the voice of everyone else. Picture a village square on a cool evening, sometime in the 13th century. The day's work is done, and people are gathering around a fire. There's the smell of wood smoke mixing with the sour tang of ale, the warmth of bodies pressed close against the autumn chill, and then a figure steps into the firelight. Maybe it's a bard with a lute, or a traveling performer who calls himself a jongleur. His clothes are worn from the road. His voice carries the roughness of someone who's spent years singing in taverns and town squares. He doesn't open with a prayer or invoke the name of the local lord. Instead, he leans in close and says something like, "What I'm about to tell you isn't in any book, but I saw it with my own eyes." That right there was the power of the medieval storyteller. They offered something the written chronicles never could: immediacy, intimacy, and the thrill of forbidden knowledge. Take someone like Tannhäuser, a legendary bard whose songs echoed through German-speaking lands in the Middle Ages. He was known for singing about love, yes, but also about desire, betrayal, the complexity of human hearts. His songs could praise a noble's generosity one moment and subtly mock a king's foolishness the next. The beauty of being a wandering performer was that you could say things that would get a chronicler imprisoned, and then simply move on to the next town before anyone could catch you. These storytellers were entertainers, sure, but they were so much more than that. They were living libraries, carrying hundreds of tales, songs, and legends in their memories. They were teachers who passed on moral lessons through stories that made people laugh and cry. They were journalists reporting news from other towns and kingdoms. And sometimes they were rebels keeping alive stories that the powerful wished would disappear. Here's something that might blow your mind. Many of the stories we think of as quintessentially medieval, tales that have shaped Western culture for centuries, only survived because anonymous storytellers refused to let them die. The legends of King Arthur and his knights, the tales of Robin Hood fighting for the poor against corrupt authority, these weren't created by educated monks in monasteries. They came from the people, passed from mouth to mouth, village to village, generation to generation. And the church often hated these stories. They saw them as dangerously pagan, full of magic and ancient beliefs that predated Christianity. Church authorities tried again and again to suppress certain tales, to erase them from memory. But storytellers kept them alive, sometimes adapting them, Christianizing them just enough to get by, while preserving the ancient heart of the stories. A chronicler in the 1300s actually wrote a complaint about these performers that's both revealing and a bit funny. He called them cursed jesters who corrupt the people with lies. But here's the question that gets to the heart of everything. Were they really spreading lies? Or was this chronicler, this man of letters and official history, simply afraid of losing control over what people believed? Think about it from the perspective of those in power. If you're a king or a bishop, you want people to believe your version of events, your narrative of how the world works and who deserves to rule. But here comes a bard who sings about a legendary king who earned his throne through virtue rather than birthright, or a noble outlaw who stole from corrupt officials to feed the hungry. Those aren't just entertaining stories. They're dangerous ideas. The storytellers created a parallel history to the official one. While chroniclers recorded the dates of battles and the names of kings, storytellers remembered how those battles felt for the common soldiers, what happened to the villages that were burned, the loves that were lost. They preserved the emotional truth of history, even when they got the dates and names wrong. And here's something beautiful about oral tradition. It's flexible in ways that written text isn't. A storyteller could adapt a tale for their audience, emphasizing different themes depending on whether they were performing in a wealthy merchant's hall or a peasant's cottage. The same story could comfort the grieving, inspire the downtrodden, or warn the powerful that their actions weren't going unnoticed. Imagine being in that audience, sitting by that fire. The bard's voice drops to almost a whisper, and everyone leans in. He's telling a story about a hero who stood up to injustice, or a forbidden love that defied social rules, or a magical quest that speaks to the yearning in every human heart for something more than the grinding routine of daily survival. For those moments, you're transported. You're not just a peasant or a craftsman or a housewife. You're part of something larger, connected to a tradition that stretches back through time. The storytellers knew something that the chroniclers often forgot. People don't just want facts and dates. They want meaning. They want to see themselves reflected in the stories they hear. They want to believe that ordinary people can be heroes, that love can transcend barriers, that justice is possible even in an unjust world. So here's something worth thinking about. When we look back at medieval history, whose account should we trust more? The chronicler who wrote what his patron wanted to hear, sitting in his comfortable monastery with all his biases and political pressures, or the storyteller who lived on the road, who survived by truly understanding what people needed to hear, who had to earn their supper every night by touching hearts and stirring souls? Comment, chronicle, or song. Which source would you trust more? Like and subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel to uncover more conspiracies. Maybe the real history lies somewhere between the two. The chronicler preserved the framework, the dates and names and events, but the storyteller preserved the soul, the meaning, the human truth of what it felt like to live in those times. And if you think about it, don't we still have both today? We have our official records, our documented facts, but we also have our stories, our songs, our ways of remembering that capture truth in ways that pure facts never could. The medieval world was shaped by both ink and voice, by both the written word that claimed permanence and the spoken word that claimed hearts. And honestly, when you're thinking about which source to trust, it's worth asking yourself, what kind of truth are you looking for? There's a moment in history that doesn't get talked about enough, but it reveals something crucial about the medieval world. In the year 1233, Pope Gregory IX issued an order that sent shockwaves through Europe. Certain stories, certain tales that people had been telling for generations, were now declared heretical. They had to be destroyed, burned, erased from existence. Think about what that means for a second. Someone in power deciding that entire stories, pieces of culture that communities had cherished and passed down, simply couldn't be allowed to exist anymore. And we're not just talking about religious texts or political treatises. We're talking about folktales, legends, songs that grandmothers sang to children, stories that gave people comfort and meaning. But here's where it gets really interesting. How do you destroy something that lives in people's memories? The church could burn books. They could round up manuscripts and feed them to the flames. Chroniclers, bound by their oaths to the church and often to kings, could be pressured to destroy records that didn't fit the approved narrative. And they did. There are gaps in medieval archives that we'll never be able to fill. Moments where we know something happened, but the official records have mysteriously vanished. Sometimes it was accidental. Sure, fire and water damage claimed many documents, but sometimes it was deliberate. Someone decided that certain truths were better forgotten. But the bards, the storytellers, they were a different problem entirely. See, a storyteller's greatest asset was also their greatest protection. They could move. A bard who sensed danger in one town could pack up their loot and be performing in another village by nightfall. They had no monastery to be confined to, no library that could be searched, no patron who controlled every aspect of their lives. Their archive was in their head, and that made them incredibly difficult to silence. So the storytellers adapted. They became masters of subversion, of hiding forbidden ideas inside seemingly innocent tales. They'd perform a story that on the surface seemed to support church teaching, but anyone really listening could hear the other message underneath. They'd change names, alter settings, but keep the heart of the story intact. A tale about ancient pagan heroes might be retold with Christian saints, but the themes of resistance and independence remained. It was a kind of guerrilla warfare, really. Not fought with swords, but with words, with memory, with a stubborn human refusal to let go of the stories that matter. And this creates a fascinating question. Who would you trust more in a situation like this? A monk who has taken vows of obedience, who could lose everything, his position, his safety, maybe even his life, if he defies the orders of his superiors. Or a wandering bard whose very survival depends on reading the room, on knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, who could disappear before dawn if things got too dangerous. The monk has stability, education, access to resources, but he's also trapped by loyalty and fear. The bard has freedom but no security, influence but no power. Each one had something the other lacked. Each one could tell you truths the other couldn't, and each one had reasons to lie that the other didn't. This tension shaped everything about how medieval history was preserved. It created two parallel streams of memory: the official version, carefully curated and controlled, and the popular version, fluid and adaptive, and much harder to pin down. But every so often, something extraordinary happened. Every so often, someone came along who understood both worlds, who could bridge the gap between the written word and the spoken one. Someone who had the education of a chronicler but the soul of a storyteller. Someone willing to take enormous risks to do something that neither group typically dared. Tell a story that served neither pure political power nor pure entertainment, but something closer to actual truth. When someone like that appeared, when they had the courage to use both the permanence of writing and the flexibility of storytelling, when they refused to simply serve one master or disappear into comfortable anonymity, they could change everything. They could preserve things that were meant to be lost. They could challenge narratives that seemed unshakable. They could create works that would echo through centuries, shaping how future generations understood the past. These were rare individuals, and their stories often came with a price, because standing between two worlds meant being fully trusted by neither. It meant making enemies among both the powerful who wanted history controlled and the rebels who wanted it destroyed. It meant walking a knife's edge between preservation and innovation, between loyalty and truth. The secret war for control of the past wasn't fought in one dramatic battle. It was fought every day, in every choice about what to write down and what to speak aloud, what to preserve and what to let fade, what to say and what to keep silent. Every chronicler who decided whether to record an uncomfortable truth, every storyteller who chose which version of a tale to perform, every person who heard a story and decided whether to pass it on, they were all soldiers in this quiet, crucial conflict. And here's what makes this so relevant: that war never really ended. Even today, we're still negotiating who gets to tell our stories, whose version of events becomes the official record, what gets preserved and what gets forgotten. We still have our chroniclers, people creating what they claim are objective records. And we still have our storytellers, people who know that sometimes the deeper truth comes through narrative rather than documentation. The medieval world understood something we sometimes forget. Controlling the past isn't just about power, in some abstract sense. It's about shaping what people believe is possible, what they think is normal, what they imagine they can become. When you control what stories people hear about their history, you control how they understand their present and imagine their future. So maybe the question isn't really who to trust, the chronicler or the bard. Maybe the real question is, what happens when someone refuses to choose? When they insist on bringing both perspectives together? When they dare to tell a more complete story, even though it puts them at risk? That's when history truly comes alive. That's when we get closer to understanding not just what happened, but what it meant. And that's when the past becomes something more than just a tool for the powerful or a comfort for the powerless. It becomes something that belongs to all of us. So here we are at the end of this journey through medieval memory, and I think we've discovered something pretty profound. The chroniclers and the storytellers, these two groups who seemed so different, who often worked against each other, who served completely different masters, they were actually two sides of the same coin. The chronicler sat in his monastery or royal court, carefully choosing which facts to preserve in ink and parchment. He wrote what power wanted to read, what would please his patrons, what would secure his position and maybe even his safety. His words became the official record, the version of events that would sit in libraries for centuries, that future historians would cite as truth. The storyteller walked the roads between villages, carrying songs and tales in his memory. He sang what the people needed to remember, What gave them hope or comfort or a sense of identity? His words lived in hearts and minds, changing slightly with each retelling, adapting to each new audience, surviving not through permanence, but through relevance. Together, these two created the Middle Ages as we know it today. The framework came from the Chroniclers, those dates and names and documented events that let us construct a timeline. But the soul, the meaning, the emotional texture of medieval life that came from the storytellers whose tales survived against all odds. And here's the haunting part. Together, they also created the Middle Ages we'll never know. Every story the church successfully suppressed, every inconvenient truth a chronicler burned, every tale a storyteller decided was too dangerous to pass on, that's lost to us forever. We're looking at medieval history through a very specific lens, one that was shaped by power and resistance, by what was allowed to survive and what people fought to preserve. The Middle Ages we study is essentially a compromise between official history and popular memory, between what the powerful wanted us to know and what ordinary people refused to forget. But you know what's really striking? We're still doing exactly the same thing today. We just have different tools. Think about it. We have our modern chroniclers, journalists, historians, documentary makers, people who create what claims to be the official record of our time. They're constrained by their own pressures, their editors, their funding sources, their need to maintain credibility and access. They write what their version of power wants to read, even if that power is now audience metrics and advertising revenue rather than kings and popes. And we have our modern storytellers, social media users, meme creators, bloggers, podcasters, people who shape popular memory through stories that spread person to person, screen to screen. They create what the people need to remember, or at least what resonates enough to be shared. Their words live not through institutional preservation, but through constant retelling and remixing. The medium has changed, but the dynamic is remarkably similar. Official narratives versus popular memory, institutional power versus distributed voices, the permanent record versus the living, evolving story. And just like in the Middle Ages, whoever controls how we remember the past shapes how we understand the present and imagine the future. The stories we tell about where we came from determine where we think we can go. The version of history that becomes dominant influences what seems possible, what seems normal, what seems worth fighting for. Our modern chroniclers might seem more objective than medieval monks, but they're still making choices about what to cover and what to ignore, what to emphasize and what to downplay. Our modern storytellers might seem less formal than medieval bards, but they're still shaping collective memory, still deciding which narratives spread and which ones fade. The question that haunted the Middle Ages still haunts us. Whose version of events should we trust? The official record that claims authority but might serve hidden interests? Or the popular stories that resonate emotionally but might sacrifice accuracy for impact? Maybe. Like in medieval times, the answer is that we need both. We need the discipline and documentation of chroniclers to give us facts and timelines. But we also need the emotional truth and human perspective of storytellers to give us meaning and connection. Neither one alone can give us the full picture. And here's something worth considering on a personal level. If you had lived in the Middle Ages, during those times when the church was burning forbidden texts and storytellers were risking everything to keep certain tales alive, what would you have done? Would you have had the courage to challenge the official history? To preserve a story that power wanted erased? To speak a truth that could cost you everything? It's easy to imagine ourselves as brave, as resistors, as people who would stand up for truth no matter what. But the reality is that most people, most of the time, go along with the official narrative because it's safer, easier, because they have families to protect and lives to live. The people who challenged medieval authority, who preserved forbidden stories, who bridged the gap between official history and popular memory, they were exceptional precisely because what they did was so difficult and dangerous. And maybe that's the real lesson here. History isn't made by some abstract force or inevitable progress. It's made by individual people making choices about what to write down, what to speak aloud, what to preserve, what to challenge. It's made by people who dare to tell stories that matter, even when it's risky, even when it would be easier to stay silent. The medieval archives exist because someone has to keep asking these questions. Keep exploring how history gets made and remembered. Keep examining the gap between official records and lived experience. Every story we uncover, every perspective we explore, every forgotten voice we help recover, that's part of continuing the work that both chroniclers and storytellers started centuries ago. So if this journey through medieval memory has sparked something in you, if you found yourself thinking differently about how we preserve and understand the past, then stay connected with this exploration. The Medieval Archives keeps diving into these forgotten corners of history, these moments where official narrative and popular memory collide, these stories that challenge what we think we know about the medieval world. Because at the end of the day, history really is made by those who dare to tell it, by people who refuse to let important stories die, who challenge comfortable narratives, who insist that the past is more complex and more human than any single version can capture. And maybe, just maybe, by being conscious of how history gets made, we can do a better job of preserving what matters in our own time.